Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. For years, when Jeremy Corbyn headed the British Labour Party, Corbyn was faced with allegations that he was presiding over a massive anti-Semitism crisis inside his party. Defenders of Corbyn countered that he was in fact being targeted with a smear campaign aimed at undermining his progressive policies, including his staunch advocacy for Palestinian rights. Well, now a long-awaited report from Britain's Equality and Human Rights Commission has come back with the results. And it found that in a party with nearly 500,000 members, there were just 2 cases of unlawful anti-Semitism. In a statement, Jeremy Corbyn responded by saying, quote, "One anti-Semite is one too many, but the scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as by much of the media." In response to that, the new Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, suspended Corbyn, saying that those remarks were inappropriate.
I was very disappointed. A difficult decision was then taken yesterday in relation to his suspension, which I fully support. It was a difficult decision, as you can imagine. It was the right decision. It was the General Secretary's decision, using the powers that he's got. But leadership sometimes involves difficult decisions, and that's why I set out my response in the way that I did.
Corbyn responded to the media.
Very shocked and very disappointed. I've been in the Labour Party all my life. And I want to make it absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism has no place whatsoever in our party or our movement. I've opposed it and racism in all its forms all my life. And that is what I've made clear during my leadership of the party, and I'll make clear today as a Member of Parliament and proud to be one.
Well, joining me is Chris Williamson, a former Labour member of the British Parliament. Like Jeremy Corbyn, he was suspended. In his case, when he pushed back against the anti-Semitism campaign and said it was being done in a bid to undermine Corbyn. Williamson was vindicated by this new report, which found that he committed no wrongdoing. Chris Williamson, welcome to Pushback. For people who are not familiar with the background to this report on alleged anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party, can you just briefly summarize what led up to this and then your reaction to the ensuing suspension of Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, there'd been a concerted campaign against Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. There was a campaign that actually started when he first managed to get onto the ballot paper in the leadership election in 2015. That was then followed by a coup of the Parliamentary Labour Party sought to try and force Jeremy Corbyn out. And there was a second leadership election the following year. And it was after that election, really, that the allegations of anti-Semitism really ramped up. And it was really around Jeremy's support for an ethical foreign policy, in particular, his support for the Palestinian people. And the allegations got more and more lurid. Many of Jeremy's supporters were targeted and suspended and then expelled from the Labour Party. And a couple of Zionist organisations called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and the so-called Jewish Labour Movement lodged a complaint. And they've been lobbying. I mean, they've been harassing the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for some time, making complaints, demanding that they investigate the party for institutional anti-Semitism. And eventually, the EHRC, relented and mounted their investigation to the party last year. This was shortly after I think I was suspended myself from the Labour Party earlier in 2019. And there'd been a long process. I was named in the report initially. I lodged a legal challenge to that. And I've been vindicated because there were no allegations against me. My name was virtually removed entirely from the report, and certainly there were no accusations levelled against me. The report was due to be published, in fact, at the beginning of September, but because of the legal challenge that I'd mounted, it was delayed because I was threatening to take an injunction out against them if my name wasn't removed from the report, because it was based on a lot of spurious, malicious allegations. And eventually they relented and they did remove my name. and it was then published. And following that, the now leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, decided that he was going to flex his muscle and make a break with the Corbyn era, if you like, and decided to support the suspension. It was actually the General Secretary of the party that suspended Jeremy, but obviously supported that decision by Keir Starmer. And he says that he accepts the report in its entirety. But I mean, the organisation itself, the EHRC, is a very questionable organisation in terms of its political affiliations. It's supposed to be an independent public body, but it has itself been accused of institutional racism. Two of its Muslim commissioners were accused of Black and Muslim community commissioners, I believe, were accused of being too loud when it came to the question of the EHRC dealing with the issue of racism, ironically. And they are also, many of the commissioners got very close ties to the Conservative Party. And it's interesting because there was speculation in the middle of this year, in fact, from Labour sources, and this was reported in some of the media, that when the EHRC report comes out, Jeremy Corbyn will be suspended. That will be used as a pretext to suspend him. And this idea of suspending Jeremy Corbyn goes back many, many years. I remember talking to a National Executive Committee member in 2015 that told me that there were people, enemies, if you like, of the Corbyn project on the National Executive Committee and close to it, who were looking for ways to find an excuse to suspend Jeremy Corbyn. This was when he was leader of the party. I mean, it's astonishing, frankly, but there's been a long and concerted campaign that has sought to undermine Jeremy Corbyn from inside the Labour Party, and this is where it's ended up. I mean, I was arguing for a long time that Jeremy, the leadership, needed to take a more robust stand against the allegations of anti-Semitism, but unfortunately, my sort of advice fell on deaf ears, and there was a continual effort to try and appease and capitulate to these absurd accusations that were being levelled against Jeremy and against the party. Bear in mind, the Labour Party has a long-standing record of standing up to racism, a proud tradition, in fact, of standing up to racism, as has Jeremy Corbyn and indeed his family. I mean, his mother was at the Battle of Cable Street when Oswald Mosley's fascists sought to try and march through the Jewish quarter. So, Jeremy's record stands any examination. Somebody whose reputation, really, to a large extent, has been staked on his stand against racism in all its forms. I mean, when the many Tories, prominent Tories, were wearing badges and sporting T-shirts that had Hang Mandela emblazoned across the front of them, he was protesting against apartheid outside the South African embassy. But I think the fact that he was a pro-Palestinian in favour of the ethical foreign policy was something that was unconscionable to many, and they sought to bring him down, and they've succeeded now.
His statement was, one anti-Semite is one too many, but the scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as by much of the media. The report seems to confirm that. For all this talk about an anti-Semitism crisis inside the Labour Party, the final report that has just come out says that there were 2 cases of unlawful anti-Semitism out of a party of more than 500,000 people. Has that fact been acknowledged widely in British media, or is that just being swept under the rug?
It's been swept under the carpet. I mean, I've sought to make that point when I've been interviewed, but unfortunately, I'm just one voice, and much of the mainstream media hasn't spoken to me at all in any event. And the way it's being spun on the broadcast media and in the print media, I mean, you would think this was an incredibly damning, lurid report, but you're absolutely right. I mean, literally only 2 cases, and they're very, very questionable in themselves. I mean, my biggest regret, frankly, is that all the other people that were named in the report didn't mount the legal action that I did. There were 6 people initially, only 6. I mean, that was the height of it, and I included myself in the draft report. As I say, we mounted a very robust legal challenge, and it resulted in my name being removed. But I think it also had the effect of removing 3 other people as well. And we're now left with just 2, one of whom is a councillor, another one is a former MP and a National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, Ken Livingstone. But the allegations against them really, in my opinion, don't actually amount to anti-Semitism in any event. And it's certainly not an indication, even if except that it did, an indication that the Labour Party was riven with anti-Semites and had an institutional anti-Semitic problem and was guilty of harassing the Jewish community. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, and the hyperbole is quite astonishing. Even though Jeremy Corbyn is no longer the leader of the Labour Party, it seems determined to not just remove him from the prospect of becoming Prime Minister of this country and leading the official opposition. They want to absolutely destroy any trace of the sort of programme that Jeremy Corbyn was spearheading when he was leader of the party. And this obviously was a modest socialist programme in terms of the economic agenda at home and an ethical foreign policy abroad. I mean, this was unconscionable to many inside the Labour Party, regrettably in the upper echelons of the Labour Party, as well as to many in the establishment who were very concerned about a party coming to office who had a Minister for Peace and Disarmament. I mean, the prospect for me was incredibly exciting, actually, of a Corbyn-led Labour government, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, with a Minister for Peace and Disarmament. And I sort of hoped that, one day maybe the UK could gain a reputation for spreading peace and disarmament around the world instead of war and arms sales, which is the present situation now.
And the hostility towards Corbyn from inside his own party was so severe that there were leaks recently that showed that there are people inside the party who were plotting so that the Labour Party would lose the 2017 parliamentary elections, in which actually, Labour under Corbyn just came very, very close to winning, to taking the government. And that only came out recently. When you tried to warn Jeremy Corbyn and his advisors that this was happening, did they recognize that the anti-Semitism smear campaign was indeed a smear campaign against Corbyn? Did they understand that this was just a solely cynical effort to try to bring him down and to denigrate his advocacy of Palestinian rights?
Yes, I think they did. And they just took a catastrophic decision that it was better to try and manage the Parliamentary Labour Party, to try and appease and try and work with people. But as I pointed out, and I've been proven correctly, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, that you cannot reason with these bad faith actors. And I did try to make that point, not just to Jeremy and his advisors, but also to the Socialist Campaign Group in the Parliamentary Labour Party. And I said, look, we just in fact, the week before I was suspended because the allegations were getting, more and more lurid, and I was, being particularly targeted, not just in terms of my support for Jeremy, but also because I was leading a campaign to radically democratise the party and, give members of the party a greater influence over the direction of the party and make MPs far more accountable to the grassroots members. And I was, targeted for that as well. But I said, look, ultimately, it's not me that they're after. They want to destroy the Corbyn project and they want to topple Jeremy. All of the people that have been targeted, if you like, Jeremy's Praetorian Guard, they are collateral damage. Ultimately, it's to destroy this modest socialist project, which had a very heavy emphasis on an ethical foreign policy. So I do think they acknowledge that. It's just that they tactically played it incredibly badly. And on the day that I was actually first suspended, this followed a meeting at the weekend where I'd said that the Labour Party had been too apologetic about its record in tackling anti-Semitism. But that was spun in the media as me saying that Labour was too apologetic about anti-Semitism, which is basically the opposite of what it was saying. It's 180 degrees in the opposite direction to what I'd actually said. And I remember speaking to Jeremy's close advisors in the leader's office. This was on a Wednesday when Prime Minister's questions take place, and they were very anxious about the adverse headlines and that this was going to be raised in PMQs. And I then, against my better judgment, said I would issue a qualified statement, a sort of qualified apology if I'd caused any offence or hurt in that sense. But I made the point in the discussions with them. I said, look, we're only in this position now because you've handled the whole question of anti-Semitism incredibly badly from start to finish. And the people in the room with me at that point in time acknowledged that. They said, yes, we've got it wrong, but we are where we are now, and this is what we need to do. And so it was a fatal error on my part to issue that qualified statement, because that was then weaponized against me. I mean, the opponents were saying, well, look, he's apologized, but it's a mealy-mouthed apology. It doesn't really mean it. He acknowledges he's done something wrong, but he's clearly not gone far enough. He's not been contrite enough. And I mean, the reality was I had nothing to be apologetic about. I mean, actually, in that speech that they were using against me, I made it very clear that we had to do everything possible to address the scourge, as I referred to it as being the scourge of anti-Semitism and all forms of racism. But the truth is, anti-Semitism, whilst it's on the rise around the world, and indeed there's been increased incidents of anti-Semitism in this country, it's very, very minuscule in reality. I mean, the most egregious forms of racism in Britain is Islamophobia. I mean, it's the Muslim community that are targeted much more so than the Jewish community. And that's not to minimize anti-Semitism in any way, but it's just a statement of fact. And as I say, as someone, myself, like Jeremy, spent our lives fighting racism. I was a working class kid in the 1970s. I left school, worked in the building industry, joined the Anti-Nazi League in the UK, which was a response to the rise of a group called the National Front, a fascist organisation, which was getting quite a good amount of traction and doing quite well in some elections. And I mean, I was an active member of that, confronting fascists on the street, and as an apprentice bricklayer on building sites, when casual racism was quite a thing, actually, in those days. I remember on more than a few occasions risking my personal safety, nearly getting into a fracas and, being literally beaten up for challenging casual racists. And to then be, accused in the way I'm being as some sort of bigot, it's absolutely outrageous. And it's clearly been weaponized, I mean, and there's no doubt about that. And of course, the fact that I've made that point, that it's been weaponized, that was then used against me as evidence that I was anti-Semitic, because I was saying to be weaponized. And I was quoting members of the Jewish community, actually, anti-Zionist Jews, who were saying that. And ironically, many of the people that have been targeted for suspension by the Labour Party are themselves Jewish, anti-Zionist Jews. I mean, one guy, for example, was, both his parents were incarcerated in Auschwitz. Obviously, thankfully, they survived it. But this is somebody who was born in Israel, served in the Israeli army, was a very strong, passionate pro-Palestinian campaigner. He was one of the first people to be targeted. His mistake was, if I can put it like that, supporting the Palestinian people and being a strong advocate for Jeremy Corbyn. And this was a trend that was happening all the way down the line. I mean, Tony Greenstein, another prominent member, who's the son of a rabbi, whose father was also, like Jeremy's mother, at the Battle of Cable Street. He was targeted, still is targeted as an out-and-out anti-Semite. Jackie Walker, a prominent black Jewish activist, vice chair of Momentum, the grassroots movement that was formed to support Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. She was also targeted. It's been a really pernicious, disgusting, despicable campaign. But one of the things it's shown me is that the right wing, if you like, and the Zionist lobby are incredibly ruthless, and they're much more ruthless than certainly that Jeremy's team and Jeremy himself has been prepared to be. Jeremy should have defended his reputation, and he should have defended his allies and defended the Labour Party's reputation from the outset. And I think if he'd have done that, then we wouldn't be in the situation now. And frankly, I think potentially Jeremy would have been in number 10 Downing Street, and we would have been in the process of transforming the country right now.
Well, he's a nice person because he actually cares for human rights.
He does. I mean, and
that actually hurt him in the end, because he's such a nice person.
It did. Absolutely. Yeah. It definitely did. I mean, Jeremy is a lovely bloke. I mean, I love the guy. And, Jeremy always sees the best in people. To be honest with you, I like to think I try to see the best in people too, but I don't know, maybe I've got a slightly more ruthless streak than Jeremy, because I could see what was happening, and this wasn't going to end well in my, I mean, and the other point I was making, because in terms of the democratization agenda that I was championing, was that unless we actually bring about greater democracy and make this parliamentary Labour Party accountable to grassroots members, even if the Labour were to win the election under a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government, we wouldn't literally be able to implement our programme. I mean, these people would have sabotaged it. I mean, and that's the top and bottom of it.
And so they tried to, and they try. There's literal evidence of Corbyn's foes literally trying to stop him from winning. in 2017.
Oh, most certainly. I mean, the leaked report that came out earlier this year was very, very clear about that. And the main protagonists inside the very highest levels of the Labour Party's bureaucracy were actively working. These were fifth columnists working to sabotage the election. And then on the day that we'd come very, very close, and it was touch and go as to whether or not we might even be able to form a government, because I think as you were saying in the opening remarks, the party was literally within a few thousand votes of actually being able to form an administration. They were in a state of mourning, believe it or not. I mean, they were incredibly depressed that Labour had done as well as they had. I mean, it was the worst possible. I've been active in the Labour Party, active in politics in every election, local, general, and even European elections since the mid 1970s. I've never known a run into. It's the worst possible run into an election in my entire life, probably in history. And yet, in spite of that, the Labour Party secured the biggest increase in vote share since 1945. And this was because people were really inspired by the programme that Jeremy was spearheading. But I think even if Labour had won that election, as I've said, it would have been very difficult to implement a lot of that. And certainly the points that I was making when I was re-elected in 2017, I was making the point that, look, when the next election comes, we have to get these democracy reforms through, because we're going to be in office but not in power, and that will be incredibly damaging to the reputation of the party, because a lot of cynicism about politics, and a lot of people putting a lot of hope and expectation in the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government, and if we then were to let them down, it would just increase cynicism. But we didn't even get that opportunity. I mean, it's far worse than that now. We've essentially got two turbocharged neoliberal establishment parties in this country now, in a similar way to in the United States. It doesn't really matter who gets in. The system will continue unabated. And
well, let me
really
so let me ask you about that. And let me just say, by the way, that being Jewish myself, it's just painful to see anti-Semitism, the memory of the Holocaust, which my family was deeply impacted by. My great-grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. My father grew up was born into Hungary, when the Nazis occupied it. It's just painful to see it being used to take down someone so genuinely committed to working people and to fighting racism.
That's the feeling of many Jewish comrades in this country too, who similarly feel incredibly hurt that they've been used as a political football. And actually, as well, it's very sinister, because there are people that maybe, in the Jewish community, who are not necessarily that politically engaged, who see this stuff, and some people, I think, genuinely believe it.
Well, I know many Jewish people who they got convinced that there is this culture of anti-Semitism, yes, and they themselves became scared, even though it was difficult to identify what exactly it was. It was just this. It was a psyop. It was a propaganda campaign to convince people that it was a problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So listen, let me ask you finally, you mentioned how the difference between the two parties now, the Tories and the Labour Party, is close to non-existent. Jeremy Corbyn, the symbol of, the grassroots. In Britain, the former Labour leader has been suspended. It's really an attack on the Corbyn wing of the party. Do you see any point now for people to try to continue in Labour and try to take it back from the neoliberal wing, or do you think this will lead to the formation of a new party in the Corbyn tradition?
Well, I hope it does, because frankly, the Labour Party is dead as a vehicle for socialism, if it ever really was a vehicle for socialism. In reality, if you look back through the Labour Party's history, it's always been really used as a tool of the establishment to keep the working class in their place, and to, I suppose, sit on any kind of revolutionary fervour that might emerge, certainly in the early days, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. But now, I mean, Tony Benn, the great Tony Benn, once said that the New Labour, the kind of Tony Blair acolytes, the New Labour cuckoos, as he put it, were taking over the Labour nest. And the problem is now they've well and truly taken it over. They've smashed all the eggs, and there is no means of us putting those eggs back together. It's impossible. And I think our only hope now is to build a new nest, and to try and, well, initially, and I'm working with others to try and build a grassroots movement. And I'm at the very beginning, really, of a new campaign to encourage trade unions to defund and disaffiliate from the Labour Party, because the organised working class are not going to be well served by a Labour government under Keir Starmer. But frankly, I'm not sure that the sort of agenda that Keir Starmer is putting forward anyway is going to be particularly attractive, and I think it just will give a green light for yet more Tory governments of the blue variety rather than a Tory government of the red variety under Keir Starmer. And I think there's a hell of a lot of people who are incredibly disillusioned, disappointed, angry, frankly, at what's been happening, even more so now concerning what's happening to Jeremy. And as I've said, there's no democracy really in the party. MPs are a law unto themselves. Even the National Executive Committee isn't particularly democratic. Only 25% of the seats on the National Executive Committee are elected by the membership. The rest are appointed by various luminaries in the party, from trade union general secretaries to the leader and himself and the leaders of the Scottish and Welsh Labour parties. So I just think now, and it's difficult to make that break. I mean, I'm somebody who spent 44 years of my life, devoted to the Labour Party and trying to fight for the Labour Party and to try and make the Labour Party a more progressive and more socialist party. But it's impossible. The days of a sort of a broad church where, the left had some influence are gone. I mean, the left has really absolutely no influence now. We had a moment in time under Jeremy Corbyn, and we had a moment at the national conference in 2018, which was squandered, where there were democracy reforms, which I'd been spearheading. I came very, very close to winning them, but unfortunately, the delegations from the trade unions voted them down, essentially, because the votes at conference are split evenly between grassroots members from the constituency Labour parties and the trade unions. And it's important for a working class party, I think, to have the organised working class movement as part of it. But the truth is that those delegations were not reflecting at that conference the views of their grassroots members. And as a consequence of that, those democracy reforms were defeated. And that then emboldened still further the opponents of Corbyn, and the anti-Semitism row ratcheted up another gear. And then obviously the moves to reject the decision that was taken in the referendum on Brexit, on leaving the European Union, was all but reversed, and became Labour policy to have a second referendum. And they basically not just sabotaged the 2017 election, they deliberately sabotaged the 2019 election because that would then, if Jeremy losing a second time, would make it very easy to then remove him as the leader and then eradicate all traces of that kind of radical proposition that the Labour Party was edging its way towards under his leadership.
Chris Williamson, thank you very much for joining us.